Welcome, everybody. We have two very special guests, my friends, Bill Warren and Bill McMullin. For those of you that just joined us, both of them are judges. Bill Warren is an FEI 4-star judge. Bill McMullin is an SUSDF judge. Both of them are riders, trainers. They give clinics throughout the states and outside the US as well. Thank you very much, Bill, and both Bills for accepting this invitation.
Thank you, Cesar, very much for inviting us. We've been looking forward to it.
Okay, this is great. We have, I think, a very interesting topic today. We'll talk about leg yielding, and we'll talk about shoulder fore, and we'll talk about shoulder in. So I don't think we need any more introduction to the Bills. Everybody knows them. And I will give you the microphone to start with. And I'm going to share my screen because we've had some slides to show you. Okay? So go ahead whenever you want.
So do we click on it then?
No, you can tell me whenever you want me to move it.
Oh, no, let him do it. Don't touch it.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I'll wreck it. I'll wreck it. No doubt. Well, Cesar asked us this evening if we would speak about leg yielding and shoulder in developing the horse. And we'd like to start with that by taking a look at the pyramid of training or the training scale. We can all start to take a look there. It's important that we don't just jump in and say, oh, we're going to leg yield or we're going to shoulder in. Do a shoulder in without thinking about some of the basics and looking at the training scale. And again, we hopefully reinforce this to all of our students and to all students of dressage at every level. This should be something that's really in the forefront of our mind as we put our foot in the stirrup every day. And looking at the bottom rung, of course, is looking at rhythm. And notice under rhythm where it says regularity and tempo. So there's a certain energy and tempo that's expected within that rhythm, which does not denote impulsion, but we have to know that our clear gaits, walk, trot, and canter that we're working on preserving and enhancing through our training and dressage stays pure. And that as we work toward developing the horse, that we don't end up interrupting that rhythm and stay very aware of that. But again, this looking at the rhythm, that it does have a certain tempo. There has to be certain energy in that, in the walk, trot, and canter. So speaking about suppleness.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to jump back and forth a little bit from our observation as judges. And I know some of you on here are also judges as well. And since we sit at C or E or B or wherever we sit, we see a lot of misunderstanding about some of these exercises. So I think Bill and I are going to jump back and forth between trainer's eyes and judge's eyes. But I think no matter what exercise that we intend to ride or teach the horse or teach the rider, it has to further enhance the horse's balance and suppleness in its way of going. Otherwise, it's there's no point. I mean, just to ride sideways is irrelevant. This is supposed to lead to something, which is this whole scale of training. We need to be developing the horse up to each part of the training scale.
But I think, and thinking about that on the training scale, even at the lower levels, we have to know about and look at the whole thing from bottom to top. It's hard to isolate necessarily just one specific piece. I mean, we can isolate the rhythm and so on, but it's all so interconnected, right? I mean, we all understand and appreciate that, we hope. And for people newer to riding and so on, need to, to study it and broaden their understanding of it as they develop a horse through the levels and improve in their riding.
In talking about the introduction to leg yield or even shoulder in, there were other prerequisites that have to be solidified as well. I mean, a horse and rider have to understand the correct geometry of ring figures and be able to have line control and the correct contact for then all of these additional movements to have any benefit to the horse and rider. So we're sort of starting a little bit not at the bottom, but assuming that people are already solid in their basic ring figures and transitions and things like that, to then be prepared for a more advanced exercise like the leg yield and shoulder in, which is supposed to have a suppling effect on the horse. But if a horse is not in a correct balance, then adding a higher level movement or exercise really doesn't have any beneficial effect. You want to take it from there?
Well, as you mentioned, you brought moving up the scale a little bit. You brought up the word contact already, which is a huge part of this, is really that ties everything together in terms of this connection and the acceptance of the bit and the acceptance of the aids. So this working toward leg yield and improving the suppleness of the horse and helps improve this contact and the acceptance. And that's a huge piece of it, as we know, in riding our horses and developing that contact. We're teaching it for those of you that teach, also teaching people to understand the right degree of contact and how that comes about is so important and can be so elusive also. And it really is, if you're thinking about going through training level, that there has to be, as Bill said already, a certain degree of balance and self-carriage, even at training level, and accepting the contact. And again, looking at suppleness, that the horse is relaxed and able to go into this contact. And then our yielding exercises start to develop the engagement that we talk about that we need to develop better impulsion. Right? At first level, we talk about developing the pushing power to show the lengthenings. So a horse has to understand and be able to get stronger in the leg yielding process. And we'll talk a little bit more about the steps we might take in developing with a young horse. And that impulsion and power starts to be there before you can then really make the horse to the degree of straightness required that it can start to carry more weight behind and carry itself to develop a greater degree of collection ultimately as we go from first level to second level.
Let me ask you a question. Since we have some people that is not from the US, I would like to ask you this question. In the US, sure. When do you introduce leg yielding? Is that training level or first level? And what are the requisites for first level? So how a horse should look at first level when he's going to show leg yielding?
Well, leg yield starts in the first level tests. First level test 2 is the first time that the leg yield is asked for. And it's a very basic introduction from a turn on the center line and straight, and then a fairly long, easy diagonal line. It's not too steep, but that's the first time it's asked for in any of our levels. And then in our first level test 3, it's a little bit more difficult because it comes from the wall over to center line instead of from a corner and a turn on the center line, which is a little bit easier to then bring the horse off the inside leg to the outside rein. It's a little bit more advanced, but anyway, first level is where it starts. But I think the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that leg yield is a basic obedience exercise to teach the horse to step away from the leg pressure, but it doesn't really have much of an engaging effect on the horse yet. That's more what the shoulder in then is necessary for, because at first level, the horse is still in a very low level balance, a little bit more of a level balance, if you would, but the hind legs are not really engaging as much as then a second level horse, which is where our shoulder in begins. So the leg yield really is not much of a gymnastic exercise for the horse. It's an obedience exercise, and of course, if the horse is correct in the contact, it can have a little bit of a loosening effect, but it doesn't really develop the engagement that we want. That's the job of the next step, the shoulder in.
But the leg yield also helps the horse to become ultimately more supple and improve the acceptance of the contact.
Correct.
As you said, it's an obedience exercise. So maybe we should move on to one of our next diagrams and talk a little bit more before you jump too much into the shoulder in. Talk a little bit about the exercises, and obviously there's many different ways we can working a leg yield, many different patterns and so on. But one of our favorite ones is
It's my favorite one.
the leg yield head to the wall, which the diagram shows here with the half circle. If you want to talk a little bit more about that.
I think what happens in a lot of cases is that riders get anxious to make the horse step off the leg and have very little control of the line and maybe the balance and the tempo and the horse's way of going. So often when it's just ridden from the center line over, the horse is falling out through one shoulder, trailing behind. These are all things that Cesar we see in the ring all the time. So I like, especially about not just teaching the horse, but to teach the riders, I like the head to the wall leg yield concept a little bit better because you have a guide or a wall in front of you to follow, and coming from the half circle, the horse is already hopefully answering the bending aids and then going straight ahead on a diagonal line, but then we just don't finish the line with the haunches and then bring the horse down alongside a few steps. And I think that's important too, that horse and rider go only a few steps at a time and not try to go long distance until things fall apart. But I like that form better in the beginning because the rider, to me, then learns to control the outside shoulder of the horse in a better way, so that then when it's ridden in the test for the first time, which is from the center line over, then hopefully we're going to see that the horse's body stays more parallel to the wall. And the other thing that a lot of riders don't understand, I talk about it in clinics, there's a big misconception that a horse should bend in leg yield, but it doesn't. The leg yield, the horse's body, I always tell in teaching, the tail, the withers, and the poll should be in one line, and the poll should flex laterally slightly away from the direction of travel. But there is no bend in leg yield because we want the horse parallel. The bending comes later on in the more advanced exercise of shoulder in because the hind legs are engaged in a more advanced way to then support the bend. So that's important, is that don't teach riders to bend, especially the neck in the leg yield, because that's not the way it's meant to be ridden.
So the head to the wall leg yield gives them, as Bill said, control of the shoulder and the outside guarding aids, as much as we drive with our forward sideways pushing aid of the inside leg at the girth, and the outside guarding aids, leg and outer rein, have to be there to help control the straightness of the shoulder so they don't overbend and get overbent in the neck and fall through the shoulder.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Sometimes you have advanced horses with very green riders, and sometimes you have green riders or green horses with advanced riders.
Mm-hmm.
Do you introduce the leg yielding at the walk first, or do you go to the trot? How do you approach that?
I think with green riders, I think it's especially helpful to at least do a certain amount in the walk, so they can get a little understanding and feel about how to apply the aids, and to understand it, especially if they're hopefully on, as you said, a trained horse, so that they can learn the feel on. But with that said, it's also important that they can then feel it if they're developed enough in their riding with in the trot, where there is at least some degree of impulsion that we don't have in the walk, that sometimes makes it actually fit together a little bit easier for them. If the walk is a little bit sluggish, if they have a hard time activating the horse and keeping it going forward enough in the walk, sometimes it isn't so easy. But I still do think it's important for a green rider to learn it, to get the aids explained to them that way.
Exactly, because I think sometimes in trot things are happening a little bit too fast for certain riders, and they don't really understand the application of the aids, and then they struggle and then push so hard with one leg, then they're collapsing and falling too much to one side. So I think it's necessary in some cases to start in the walk, but then we have to get on with things a little bit. So then you have to challenge them to then be able to ride the same in trot. But once they understand, then to me, it's not such a problem to go onto the trot.
Right.
But sometimes just for their own mental relaxation about the exercise, the walk sometimes gives them that time.
And on the flip side, as you mentioned about if we have an experienced rider or trainer on a young or green horse, doing it in the trot is probably more beneficial because they can balance the horse and it keeps the forward momentum, and not doing too much lateral work in the walk on a young horse, which can end up ultimately deteriorating the walk rhythm.
And
Yeah,
any recommendations when the riders are falling to the inside or to the outside? How do you correct that? What is your advice for riders?
Well, we have another, in a moment, we have another exercise that I think can help with that some too, with the stepladder leg yield a little bit. But obviously, I think as a teacher, I think you also need to stay, and this is a nice example of a head to the wall leg yield, the nice horse and rider who sits very level in her hips and shoulders, and you see the horse coming from left leg to right rein, and with the flexion left in the jaw and the crossing hind leg. And you can see her right leg is a nice outside guarding leg. It hangs nice and quietly on the horse. So the horse is moving in a supple way without bending, but forward into the right rein from the left leg. So that's a nice seat. This is a really great picture from this angle to see that levelness of the seat, so that the rider's not collapsing in the hip or, as you said, falling through their shoulder, or collapsing in the hip.
Don't mean to interrupt, but I think as teachers, it's, go ahead. Yeah. He says you will interrupt me anyway. I think it's important as teachers that we are really strict about the seat position and the correct application of the aids, and not let riders just, for the sake of riding an exercise, let things like that slide, because it's going to follow them through every movement anyway. So I think at these basic exercises, I think we really have to be diligent about making the riders understand how they should sit and where each leg is supposed to be, because if it's not correct now, then later on in the half passes, we see riders either falling to the outside, pushing like mad with one leg, and then sitting crooked, and all of this really disturbs the horse's balance. So I think we can't just say, oh, well, let them do it any old way just so that they can then go down the center line next week.
Well, going back to what you said at the very beginning, Bill, was that the rider has to have certain control of the geometric figures of the ring and their own balance and so on, before doing it. But on the other hand, a newer rider, learning the leg yield really helps them to get an understanding and a feel of really riding the horse from inside leg to outer rein and how to really apply the aids. But it just has to be monitored very carefully, as you said, that they don't get sitting crooked.
Okay, do we go to the next slide?
Yes. So in talking about, I think this can be a helpful tool in the straightening to help it helps the horse, and the rider has to be aware too. If we do a leg yield, and this specific one starts from the wall going toward the center line, but it could also be the same going from the center line to the wall, breaking it up with a few straight steps in between the leg yield. So we usually refer to it as like a stepladder leg yield, and you can do two or three segments of it depending on the balance and the ability of the horse and rider at that time. But this straightening after 3 or 4 steps of leg yield, say to the quarter line, then riding straight and a little forward, helps the rider and the horse to rebalance and readjust. If any of the forward willingness to go forward is lost in the leg yield, then it can be asked for to go a little bit better forward in the straight, so we have more energy and a little better tempo to ride the second leg yield.
I have a question from one of our participants, and the question is, what about the turn on the forehand? Is it really helpful to develop the horse
Yes,
and the rider as well?
I think that's a prerequisite to this leg yield, but again, we didn't have time to cover everything. But I think the correct understanding of the turn on the forehand is really important. And there's different forms.
Cesar, can you actually go back to the head to the wall diagram for a moment?
Of course.
Let's go back there quick. One exercise I really like in terms of the turn on the forehand is from this head to the wall leg yield, is at the end before, and it can be anywhere before they get to the corner, is that it can be either from a halt or in motion, but they've already been leg yielding here from the right leg to the left rein, is to halt, and then from the right leg to make the turn on the forehand, to bring the quarters the rest of the way around, and then they can proceed straight ahead. Another variation of the head to the wall exercise, and then using the turn on the forehand to reinforce the yielding of the inside leg to the outer rein. And there's many configurations also. And with a younger horse, sometimes the quarter turn, making a big square and a quarter turn on the forehand, and then coming in and getting out, getting in, getting out, and then going on to trot is very helpful too. And then doing the leg yields, some version of leg yield after that, once they understood the turn on the forehand a little better.
We use turn on the
I
forehand
have a question.
lot.
Did you ever had the turn on the forehand as a movement in
Yes,
some
many,
tests
many
before,
years ago.
many years ago?
Yes.
And do
Yes.
you know why it was taken away?
Probably because so often it wasn't ridden correctly and judges got sick of seeing horses.
I think it's
in
one
distress.
it's one of the most useful movements, and I mean, we use it so much for horses and riders at almost any level. I mean, you know, and I'm always surprised sometimes if I go to teach a clinic and work toward a turn on the forehand exercise, honestly, how many people can't ride it or don't ride it at all.
But I think
And
that also ties into problem when that can't be ridden correctly. I'm convinced also that there's a misunderstanding of then turns on the haunches and walk pirouettes and things like that. And all of these things tie into then the many bad reinbacks that we see because horses have not been ridden through to the contact properly in all these basic little exercises, nor do the riders have any concept of it because it hasn't been taught.
Okay, that was very, very, very important. So,
and I see a question just came up, and we discussed this a little bit earlier before people came on about in terms of the gaits and can you leg yield and canter. And generally so far we've talked about the walk and the trot, which is what we see in our test, in the first level test, to see it in the trot. But as was discussed in general, that most of us do use and find it very helpful to do some leg yielding in the canter also. It's never asked for in a test, but as Cesar, as you even pointed out, it's a very good suppling tool and can really help the horse from inside leg to outer rein and to become more supple.
good.
We find often that unless a movement is asked for in a test, then it's never trained.
That's true.
Unless it's something that's in a test, then why?
Yeah, that's true. But for training, it's very, very important. So I was
Absolutely.
a good question. Whoever make that question, thank you very much. So do we move on?
Yeah, move on to, let's go ahead to the shoulder fore, shoulder in diagram. There we go.
I think this is also very important, that we really teach riders a clear understanding of the difference between shoulder fore and shoulder in. I often, when I am giving clinics and I ask somebody to ride shoulder fore, it's a perfect shoulder in, and they think they did a good job. And I say, well, that's a great shoulder in, but that's more than what I wanted, because the shoulder fore is only a straightening exercise. And then they think that that is okay for shoulder fore. So then when it's time to then practice shoulder in, then they're on such a wide angle in 4 tracks. So I think it's really important that riders also see that these diagrams and these little details are pointed out so that they're not riding one exercise thinking they're riding something else.
Well, I always show people that are trying to get a feel for what shoulder fore is about. As you see in this diagram, if we don't ride in shoulder fore, if we let the horse to his own natural tendencies, the shoulders are narrower than the hindquarters, so the outside foreleg gets closer to the wall than the haunches, and often the haunch would end up looking a little bit haunches in if we don't address it. So in shoulder fore, as it says here, the horse's outside front leg, hind leg follows the track of the outside front leg. So that outside front leg has to be brought in alignment off the track. And again, shoulder fore is straightening the shoulder, not bending.
But I think this is where also a ground person for riders is important. That in shoulder fore, the inner hind leg is visible between the 2 front legs. But if the rider doesn't understand that and they're always riding too much, then they're not gaining the correct education for what's going to come down the road. So I think we have to really be as helpful to the riders as possible. Because then, like I said, if they're riding shoulder in when they think they're riding shoulder fore, then the shoulder in is going to be very wide angle. And I say it in my judging all the time, shows better angle than bend, because there's so much sideways going and all that it's just not correct.
So moving from the shoulder fore to the shoulder end, now we see 3 tracks. The inside hind leg and the outside foreleg are on the same track, and the spine does bend. But the neck and the spine are bent to the same degree, that the neck doesn't bend more.
I always tell riders that the base of the neck should always be straight. The neck should always stay center of the horse, no matter what the movement is. And often the neck is taken past the line of the inside shoulder because they heard once upon a time more bend. So what happens? Take the neck more, and then that doesn't allow for very much freedom of the shoulders when the neck is so much displaced.
And I think, and in terms of helping the rider, go ahead, Cesar.
Go ahead, Cesar.
I have a question going back a little bit to leg yielding and just shoulder forward, not shoulder in.
Yeah.
But do you think many times you see in all levels, but training level and first level, horses dropping the haunches or falling into the inside shoulder? Do you use a lot on your training, a lot of leg yielding and shoulder forward to correct straightness and also to help in the transitions? And could you elaborate a little bit on that?
You want me to talk?
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I tend in teaching to ride or have the riders ride a lot of diminishing and enlarging of the circle, to also make them have to think about the line control. If they have to do something other than think about what they perceive in their head as sideways, doing it in conjunction with the circle line, I think really then makes them have to pay attention to controlling the outside shoulder, otherwise the circle falls apart. So I tend to do a lot of that in conjunction with the circle line, and then coming in, spiraling into 10 meters and enlarging to 20, and not just maintaining shoulder forward position, but control of the turning of the circle. And that seems to help before then we go, straight ahead or on a diagonal line to add the same thing. Because I think when a rider doesn't have control of the geometry, down the road, they're not going to have any better control of a pirouette. It's impossible. So I think these details just have to be really paid attention to.
And I think riding transitions, especially early on in shoulder 4, where you can help a rider to understand how to keep the horse in that position when they make a transition. So even a simple transition, just trot to walk and back to trot. But if they can use the long side and hopefully a mirror, or that you stand in front of them, so to help them understand that they can keep that same position, the exact same position and steadiness of the contact in and out of each transition, the downward and the upward, without changing the angle, or in other words, keeping the straightness of the shoulder 4. And then as the horse gets more advanced, to be able to do the transitions in a shoulder in the same angle, that it doesn't change. The haunches don't then fall out, or the neck doesn't get pulled more in, and so on in the actual transition.
I just did this with a rider today, and when we really got the horse going well and shoulder in, and then I said, okay, now we're going to add transitions. And then, the first couple were really shaky. I mean, she went to halt, and then the haunches went one way, shoulders went another, and that increased the difficulty for the rider. And then eventually it all happened many times in a good way, and really got the horse's haunches down, because in the shoulder in, as the inner hind leg becomes better engaged, the inner hip of the horse should lower. And that really makes the horse have to work a little bit harder through the muscles, but then now start to add transitions on top of that. That increases the challenge for horse and rider. And I think that's always important. The transitions within these movements is quite helpful, and not just riding a shoulder in, okay, that worked, go on to something else. But there's so many creative things that can be done.
Okay, we have a question there from Gretchen Lutman. The question is shouldering a 3-track movement or a 4-track movement? That was her question.
As you can see in the diagram here, the second diagram, the shoulder in, it's clearly on 3 tracks. We talk about 3 sometimes to 3.5, but if it goes to 4 tracks, the angle is then too wide. And if it's on 4 tracks, then usually you have a hind leg that's actually crossing. We have to really keep in mind, and this diagram is very clear, with the 2 arrows on the hind legs are going directly forward. the hind legs aren't going sideways. They're going forward, and the horse carries the bend through its body, but the inside hind leg steps directly forward into the track of the outside front leg. If we go to fore tracks, if we bring that over, then inevitably the inside hind leg is going to be crossing over in front of the outside hind leg, effectively making it a tail to the rail leg yield.
So,
and often we see that when we judge, right, Cesar? You see that too.
we see that quite often, and then obviously, and she was also asking, I don't know if you could see the question on the screen.
No.
The question was how we maintain balance. So of course, if it is on 4 tracks, it's very difficult to maintain the engagement, to maintain the balance.
Right.
And I think people is getting confused because Travers and Rambert can be on 4 tracks, and then people get confused with the shoulder in. So
Yes.
I think, could you elaborate a little bit on that as well?
Well, I think to gain better control of the haunches, if the horse tends to go wide, I often will have a rider then ride between the correct shoulder and as we see it here, and then slowly change to the Rambert bend, because then I feel that the horse gets better control of, well, what was the outside shoulder then becomes inside because of the bend, but the shoulder in has a lowering effect on the inner hind leg, and then when we switch to the Rambert, that has a more lowering effect on the outside hind leg. So I think intertwining certain exercises together can then give the horse, of the rider, better control of the horse's way of going, to then not have the haunches cheating and escaping so that it becomes 4 tracks.
Cesar, I think the next photograph shows the chestnut horse and shows the 3 tracks pretty clearly. I don't know why it didn't come out. Oh, sorry, it doesn't have.
Can't see
sorry,
the
it doesn't have the feet. That was, oops. Anyway, but I think even in that picture,
but you can still see
you can still see the inside hind leg and the outside front leg on that line, and it's carrying, you know, the equal bend in the flexion of the pole, the neck and the body are bending the same. And the rider's outside guarding leg is there. Inside legs should stay down more at the girth.
There's certain things that we don't like about this picture, but we had to look through so many, and we just said, okay, there's clear the 3 tracks. That's what we wanted to show.
I think one thing, going back a little bit, that what you had some notes, Bill, also is talking about the prerequisites for shoulder in, one of them being that the horse needs to be able to ride a well-balanced 10-meter circle. That has to be a prerequisite to ride a shoulder in.
That's true.
And also meaning a perfect 10-meter circle.
But the
haunches are not escaping to the outside, which often we see. The rider wants desperately to make sure the horse bends enough in the 10-meter circle and impress the judges, but they're also unknowingly then pushing so much with the inside leg that the haunches are going sideways, crossing over, which isn't correct. And then the same thing then continues when they ride from the 10-meter circle to the shoulder end. The hind legs are crossing, and the hitting of the fence, as I don't know, Cesar, I know you hear it all the time too, but one of my pet peeves in judging is when I hear the hind legs of the horse always hitting the fence, then the rider doesn't have correct control of the balance.
Well, again, the outside guarding aids are so important for the engagement and the development of the shoulder in. That's really what helps to be able to have the right half halt and engage the horse and develop the cadence that we want from the shoulder in. The shoulder in was done for a reason, to develop more cadence and better self-carriage in the horse.
You're going to excuse me, but I'm going to talk about from my times as a rider. So many times you go out of the ring as a rider, and then you have the square paper, and then it says, not enough angle, not enough bend, 6. And then many times people question, like, if I don't do a lot of angle, then I will get a bad score. How would you react, or, you know, what would you do if you have that kind of a problem? Like, is it better to stay at the classical movement and then get the engagement that is coming from a correct shoulder in, or just fake it to have a good mark because this judge, whatever he is
Yeah,
asking and he's requesting more angle, and that's kind of very disappointing for the riders.
it's
So
an excellent question. And I talk about this a lot with certain riders. And I tell everybody, with no disrespect to any of my colleagues, but I tell the rider, look at the comments and try to learn from them, but don't be too quick to change everything every time you hear something, because next week somebody's going to tell you something else. So my feeling is stick to the classical principles and it'll take care of itself. But if they change, okay, that one said more angle, that one said more bend, then I think the training of the horse becomes really all over the map. And then to me, there's no real building blocks because everything's being changed all the time. So I tell them, yes, read the comments, but I mean, this is for me a good example of shoulder in, but wider than that wouldn't be correct. So if somebody says that's not enough angle, then I tell my rider, just stick to the classical principles and you'll be fine.
good, that's great. I have some couple of questions here. There's one that says, there are times that you do not have a mirror and you're riding without a person on the ground. What reference can you use to find the 30 degrees angle?
It's a good question.
Now there's a challenging question.
Well, I think you already said it. When you mentioned what you said about the base of the neck, I thought that was that was very important.
And also this thing about the prerequisite of the 10-meter circle, often teach it that when you start after the 10-meter circle, that you bring the forehand one step into the 10-meter circle and you ride the bend of the circle with you up the lung side. And if you can have that feeling that you could ride a 10-meter circle at any time easily without overbending the neck, then you should be at about the 30-degree angle.
Okay, and
Yeah,
there's
you
another.
answered that well.
Thank you.
There's another question. How do you correct the tilting in the shouldering?
Often that can be if the horse isn't forward enough from the inside leg. It can be caused by a couple of different reasons, right? Many. A rider that pulls too much, maybe pulls it down here or pulls too much on the outside rein and we get the head tilt, or not enough engagement, enough going forward from the inside leg, or we're losing the haunches and the outside guarding leg has to be there. There can be many causes of that. But I think if that's happening, then the horse needs to be made straighter and to go forward again, and then to readdress in a maybe to the shoulder fore and developing the shoulder in without too much angle until it becomes level, and not trying to make more.
And there's
sometimes if I see the shoulder in tilted, then sometimes I'll have the rider only ride a few steps of shoulder in and then go straight again and ride with a little bit more determination forward, and then maybe a 10-meter circle again and shoulder in just a few steps and then straight ahead again to keep reinforcing that forward attitude into both reins. Because often, for whatever reason, whether a rider's too strong, well, we're all strong on one side, and we have to face that fact and be aware of it and work on it all the time. But I feel like a few good steps is better than a whole long side and shoulder and going, oh, what am I going to do about this tilt? to really just shorten the distance and then do something else. And to me, that has a better impact on the horse and rider rather than just saying, well, I'm going to go the whole long side until the damn horse stops tilting.
So there's another question here. As a judge, from what letter can you appreciate a shouldering in the best?
Probably, well, I mean, obviously we more often sit at C for those of us at, but if you're able to sit on the quarter line, then you're closer, right? If you're sitting at M or H, you get to see it a little bit better in terms of the tracks and the carriage.
I think that's...
You judge more there, and Cesar, you guys, I don't get to judge on the quarter line.
It's a more clear view of the shoulder and I don't often like judging the shoulder in on the center line because hardly anybody rides it correctly anyway. It's just what we already talked about.
And
The
Cesar said everybody wants to ride it with a greater angle.
Yes,
to
the
get
angle
this
and the haunches are off the center line, which isn't correct. So I really don't like judging shoulder in on the center line because then I feel like I'm being negative all the time because I mean I see it, the haunches. So I have to come down a little bit in my marks, but yet the ones on the side might think it looks pretty good, but there we are on the center line.
As somebody
judging.
just commented there, I saw that judging from the side is more difficult for sure.
Yeah.
When we judge from the side, we can only judge certain things about it, whether it's a shoulder in or a half pass. We can look at the top line, the outline, the carriage of the horse, the acceptance of the bit, the stepping through from behind, but not necessarily the angle and the bend. We aren't supposed to be able to comment on the bend when we're sitting on the side.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And well, when you're sitting at sea, for instance, the other problem is that when you're watching half passes, for instance, then sometimes you see no bend, and then the other judges from the sides kind of cannot see it that well, especially in the St. George test, and the shouldering in the I-1 test. That's one thing that the judge at sea sees, and there's another
Correct.
thing that the judge from the side sees. So that's when our differences come.
For sure.
There is a question here that I think it's important. Do I have to have a good forward moving horse in order to ride these movements? If we're not forward, or if the horse is behind the leg, can we get a good leg yielding or a good shoulder fore?
That's a good question. And as we have addressed it a little bit already, going back to the leg yield, like we said, if the impulsion or the energy is lost in the leg yield, that step ladder exercise will then straighten and go forward again for a few steps and then leg yield again. So we have that energy and willingness to go forward. And then the same with the shoulder in, as Bill said, it's better to ride a handful of small just a handful of steps and then just straighten and go forward again and come back to it, especially because sometimes this loss of energy and impulsion can lead to the head tilt and other problems and deterioration of developing the connection in the horse.
I think it's also important because, we have so many different breeds too. And there are certain horses just by nature that are full of power and will to go. And then we have other breeds that are a little bit different. So I think you have to take that into consideration. We have a lot of quarter horses in our country, and they're not necessarily big, powerful, moving warm bloods, but can they still be ridden correctly in the leg yield, shoulder in? Yes, but there's a certain forwardness that I think is different for every horse. And I think when we sometimes tell riders, oh, your horse isn't enough forward, well, that can be a little bit dangerous depending on the situation, because if you've got a not so big moving horse, not a lot of looseness in the back, not a lot of freedom in the shoulders, and then they hurry, then I don't think there's a chance then to engage those horses. So I think that word forward or impulsion has to be taken carefully depending on the situation with certain horses and riders, that we don't teach people to rush around.
Yeah, and I would also like to make a comment, because sometimes, especially when we're judging, we see many horses in a day, let's say a very long St. George class, and most of the people may have the right angle. So the question at the end comes, why am I still on the 60%? And then there are other riders that are on 68, and there are some other ones that are at 78. Most of the people is doing, let's say, the shouldering where we have from 6 to 8 or to 9 or from 4 to 9. But I think what people is not taking into consideration is the quality of the engagement and the quality of the suppleness and the gait itself. And that makes riders a little bit confused, because sometimes you can see exactly the 3 tracks, but the horse is on the forehand.
Exactly.
So that just the three tracks alone doesn't give you an 8. You
No.
really must.
Absolutely.
I totally,
Like you said,
agree.
the elasticity, the willingness to stay active and forward, and again, this up in the shoulders. I mean, so we're looking for is that, and that's what shoulder in is about, is developing better self-carriage in the horse. Self-carriage that's relative to the level. From second level, growing to third, fourth level and onward, that we keep improving that.
Yeah, we had a comment here from Fiona that was saying the shoulder in should be ridden from a collected trot. So aren't we looking at the active engagement of the hind leg, not focus on the forward alone? And I think that's important, right?
It is. I mean, that's where collection begins, is at our second level, and that's the first time shoulder in is asked for, and that's quite correct. This is where collection begins. You can't ride shoulder in a trot that's hurried on the forehand, because all you're going to have is too much angle and the hind legs so far out behind the horse because it's not in the correct collected balance.
Correct. That's very important. So can we move to the next one?
Yeah, here.
Somebody told this rider to bend more.
Yeah.
So we look at, we had wanted to find an example of the overbent neck, especially. So this shows the neck bent more than the body. It also shows the rider's inside leg way too far back. The rider's leg in a leg yield and a shoulder in should be down in its normal position close to the girth. The outside leg can be back. And that's a mistake a lot of riders make. They bring the inside for leg yield and shoulder, and they bring that inside leg back further when the horse doesn't want to go over in a leg yield or to bend in the shoulder end. So when we see a myriad of problems that happen in this. So again, the neck over bent, hind leg crossing, her leg back too far, and you can even see for the part of her body that's there, she's tilted to the inside also. So she's no longer sitting level over her horse. So this is very, very disruptive to the training scale.
But we see this.
So Anita Barone is asking, so no crossing of hind legs in shouldering? That's the question.
Right. Yep. We talked about that. We talked about when the 3 or 3.5 tracks exactly back to here. If it goes to 4 tracks, then the inside hind leg is going to be crossing the outside hind leg, and then and again effectively then you have a leg yield, right?
Yes.
But not an engaged shoulder in.
Right.
Yes.
Defeats the purpose of the shoulder in when
Yes,
it's
I think
crossing.
this is a very important graphic, and all the riders, trainers, judges should take into consideration.
Yeah, this probably is the most important picture. These two next to each other here, the shoulder forward and shoulder in,
Okay,
really
so
is.
I'm gonna go back.
The shoulder in is our basic that's what we have to have for everything moving on.
So
This is an old picture, so nobody's say anything
nobody's saying
about
the top
that I
hat.
don't have a helmet, because it's an old picture.
I wanted to show this because I thought it was a good shoulder in, but also it doesn't happen so much right now because we're not judging, but I often get asked by people, oh, do you ride? And it's like, well, we had to ride to get here, and yes, I still ride and compete. But anyway, so we decided to just put that on, but he didn't want to because of the top hat, and I said, put it on.
Okay, good. That's a really good.
Next one. And this is a little bit more advanced. Well, that horse that he was on was in St. George, but this is a horse that I competed in 4th level, and I just thought it was a good example of uphill structure and the correctness of the 3 tracks. Although it's not, I wish it were taken from the very front so you could see the 3 tracks. It's a little bit from the side, which makes it a little bit harder. But anyway, yes, we do ride.
But I especially like in this picture, if you look at the mayor's outside shoulder, the freedom of the shoulder,
Yes.
and the reach and the scope and the movement is really
The
clear
lateral,
there.
the lateral reach, which is not possible on a horse that's on the forehand.
Okay, good. So now we have our last.
Yeah, so just bringing it full circle back to the training scale again. But thinking about how from leg yield to shoulder in, developing this progression of the training of the horse and the acceptance. So now we've gone to that we have to have, as somebody said, that shoulder in is done in collection. So at second level, that's a huge jump to go from first level to second level. And we suddenly have that word collection that follows us from there, from second level all the way through Grand Prix. So, and of course, when we judge second level, we see a lot of different interpretations. Well, we may see all through all the levels, but at second level, you know, to see a horse that really does have a degree of collection for second level, it's, you know, it takes a special horse and rider to start really achieving that in the correct way.
Can I also add to that? I don't want to make it seem like we only pick on the lower level horses and riders, because Cesar, we see it in the CDI ring as well.
Yes.
We see very good riding. We see not so good riding. And some of what we've talked about tonight, some of the mistakes carry over even into the CDI ring. So it's not that we just want to pick on the lower level horses and riders. Which is why I think we have to be so strict, because if it's not ridden correctly now, it's not going to be ridden any different in Grand Prix. And okay, somebody can buy a horse and put the legs on and piaffe passage, but there's so many other things where the flaws will come out.
Yeah, and when we were thinking about the topic of this conversation, I thought leg yielding and then shoulder fore and then shoulder in are so important, because they're the preparation for many other movements.
Absolutely.
That if you don't really have a good shoulder in, then you can hardly have a good half pass.
Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more.
You really need to master the shoulder in and the shoulder fore for so many things throughout the test.
Yeah.
Okay, so now if anybody has a question, I can give the microphone to all of you, but if I give the microphone, please take into consideration that you cannot start asking everybody at the same time, because then nobody hears anything, okay? So I'm gonna activate the microphones for everybody that wants to talk. So if you have any questions for our friends, the Bills, you're welcome. Gretchen, do you have any question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, for me, it's very important when we are doing the shoulder fore and the shoulder in, if the horse is not in balance, it's impossible to do it correctly. And for this, this is the most important stage in order to do it. That's my answer. My question is it correctly done if it is balanced?
Well, I think if the horse is not correctly balanced in basic little things before, then riding the shoulder fore, shoulder in is not going to be successful. So then we have to take a step back down the ladder, maybe one step, and then fix it in another way, whether that's to put the horse and rider either back on a circle and transitions and making sure that the horse's balance is correct, that it's not leaning on the forehand, and the rider being able to sit in a nice way and be able to give the hands a little bit and not be hanging on in the riding and then pushing like mad when it's time to then go do shoulder fore or shoulder in. So I think when there's problems in what you just said, then we have to come down a step and fix it in another way. Otherwise, the horse and rider are learning bad things in those movements.
Okay, and there's one more question I wanted to ask you is, for example, when I'm doing a half pass, for me, he has a tendency to tilt, exactly what you were talking before.
Right.
And so, but I realized that I need to use more outer rein instead of inner rein.
That's correct. I mean, I think the horse has to be, before the exercise, relatively balanced or correct in both reins, so that if then, say for instance, you want to give the inside rein a little bit in the half pass, then the horse stays in balance. Because I think there are times when in the half pass, the rider needs to give a little bit on the outside rein. But if the rider gives on the outside rein and then the neck comes flying over past the other shoulder, well, then the horse was not correctly on the outside rein anyway, because when you give, then the horse should stay in self-carriage. And same
Yes.
thing, if you give the inside rein, then it shouldn't mean that the horse goes in counterbend. So you want to make sure before you ride the exercises that the horse is really in balance on both reins. But then I would say also check in, does your horse tilt in travers?
No, he doesn't tilt in the travers, but he tilts in the half pass. But if I use more outer rein and no inner rein, then he does not tilt. But it's only on the right side. On the left side, he's perfect.
But remember that every half pass starts from shoulder 4, yes? So we have to have, as you said, even you said, going back to that having this correct balance to be able to do shoulder 4 and shoulder in is our prerequisite. So if in the half pass, and again, we're getting off our subject almost a little bit here, but from the half pass that I can also then ride forward into shoulder in again and help correct the problem, and then the half pass again.
Okay, so I do shoulder in, half pass, shoulder in, till he stops tilting.
Exactly.
I would like to add that the horse must also be supple at the jaw and at the poll. And
Yes.
sometimes that tilting in the shouldering and in the half pass comes out of tension at the jaw or at the poll. And
I agree.
I think that's very, very important to make sure that you have the horse really supple at the poll and at the jaw. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Can I ask?
Has a question? Please go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a question. When you have already the clear concept of the leg yielding or the shouldering, it is okay to play with the rhythm? I mean, going little trot or collected trot and go on, so you can make more supple.
I think I know what you're trying to ask, and yes, I teach it, I ride it, that you have that stride control, that you can make the horse adjustable, that in the shoulder in, can I go bigger towards medium without losing the correct 3 tracks and then make a smooth transition back to collection? Absolutely, because it makes the horse more elastic, more adjustable. It opens the back, and then to come back, then the haunches have to bend and take more weight. So yes, not just getting in shoulder and then always the same trot, because you want to challenge yourself and the horse. So I ride it and I teach it a lot to not just keep it always the same.
The same, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think Rosina makes a very good point.
Yeah.
Gary Rockwell usually says the horse has to flow in the shouldering, has to flow into the half pass, and I think it's important that the horses don't get used and don't start going smaller steps. That you have that feeling of growing and flowing into the movement. So that's a very good point, Rosina. Thank you.
For sure.
Cesar, also I was the one who asked about the turn of the forehands, because sometimes you see the riders that are very strong with hands.
Mm-hmm.
So they try to lean on the hands and not on the it properly. So the turn the forehands help about that, and to make soft on the paw and the mouth of the horse.
Yes, absolutely.
I always teach in the turn on the forehand that the inside rein, they keep the flexion inside, but the inside rein should become a little bit neutral. You know, it's not pull it like that everyone's to pull, but it's not pulling. It just it becomes, as you said, soft at the pull and the jaw from a neutral.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question from Linda. She's asking if you could talk a little bit about shoulder fore in canter.
The shoulder fore and canter.
Oh, and canter.
In canter.
Shoulder fore and canter is really essential for making a horse straight in canter. As we said before in our little diagram, if we're not in shoulder fore, the horse's shoulders go to the wall and the haunches go in. And in canter, we often see that amplified or exaggerated. It happens even more in canter sometimes than it might in walk or trot. So shoulder fore is especially important in the canter to get the straightening and the development of the canter in the horse from the beginning. And that at an early stage that the horse is made to understand that to get stronger, that he's not allowed to go with the haunches in.
But
on his own accord.
It's also necessary to then help the horse stay narrow in its hind legs and come under the body. Because often if horses sometimes appear optically straight going into the canter, and then you stand behind them, but they're cantering with their hind legs very wide, we need this shoulder fore to then help the haunches come more under and stay more narrow under the body so it supports itself and not
but then
this
you
going
need
along
more.
with wide hind legs.
Remember, a horse with a narrower base behind has a better balance to be able to stay lighter on the forehand. Like Bill said, if they're wide behind, then they go down on the forehand.
And what do you think of a shoulder fore and then leg yield at a canter, and then shoulder fore and then leg yield?
That combination can be very helpful too, as we discussed earlier, the suppling effect that we get from leg yielding and canter, but being able to balance it with shoulder fore in between, absolutely. Because you want, even in the leg yield, we want that control of the outside shoulder. That's where we start to get that straightness. So
exactly, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think it's a very good exercise.
Yeah, I remember Robert Dover used to say that shoulder fore was like the first position for ballet. You really mastered first position in ballet, and shoulder fore is kind of the same for dressage. Very, very important.
Yeah, I was only wondering because I was always worried with the inside leg if it was not too much weight on them. ¿Me entiendes lo que quería decir?
No, can you say it again? ¿Lo puedes repetir, por favor?
Bueno, por ejemplo, cuando estás haciendo el apoyar, entonces estás haciendo espalda adentro, bueno, shoulder fore y la pierna, y digamos, si estás yendo a la izquierda, la pierna izquierda toma mucho peso, entonces siempre me preocupaba si le estaba dando demasiado peso a la pierna.
Okay, the question is as follows. For instance, she's saying, for instance, if you're doing half pass left, she was saying that she's always concerned that she was putting too much weight on the inside hind leg. What would you like to comment about that? On the half pass left, if you're...
Pero sobre todo shoulder fore y entonces leg yield, ¿verdad? En galope.
Oh, when you're doing in the canter and you're doing shoulder fore and leg yielding.
Sí, exacto.
I think, well, go ahead, Bill.
Well, no, I mean, I think I said it earlier about intertwining certain exercises and movements is very beneficial. I don't feel that you need to be concerned about overweighting your horse's inside hind leg if you're only doing it for short distances. To say, you know, ride several strides of the half pass and then going directly ahead shoulder fore, I think then really is giving you stride control, line control, and all of these things. And not, I mean, we have some very well-trained horses that sometimes, you know, they're so programmed, especially if they're competing all the time, that you point them on one line and they do a half pass, whether you wanted to do the half pass or not. And the rider sits there helpless going along for the ride. So I think what you're saying is, to me, makes good sense, that you're making little adjustments in the movement and then knowing, hey, I really have control of my horse. I can ride 4 jumps of half pass. I can go directly ahead shoulder fore. I can go to the half pass again. I think that's quite creative.
Okay, thank you, because I was really worried because I always felt that maybe I was over charging the hind leg.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I would like to make a comment. Whenever I go
Yes.
to horse shows, and I'm not judging, I really like to go and see the warm-up. And in the important competitions, you see riders, upper level riders, so I'm talking FEI riders, doing a lot of leg yieldings in the trot and in the canter. And to me, at times it worries me because you see, you know, they start doing the movement, they get the suppleness crossing that they need, but they have to go all the way across the diagonal. Like if the horse is doing it well and it's already supple and it's going nice, why do you have to go all the way to the other side? You know,
Exacto.
in my opinion, it is, if you get the benefit of the movement, then you can go straight. You don't have to put, you know, just to keep doing it like from here to there, because that's what I'm seeing usually at the horse shows. And usually at the end of the diagonal, there is a loss of rhythm or the horse is falling into the forehand. I mean, not many can do it. Obviously, the really, really good pairs can do it. But if you're getting the suppleness that you need and the crossing that you need, I think.
Well, that's when I think it becomes overriding,
Yes.
overworked, and then we don't see such a happy horse anymore.
Yes.
I
Exactly.
mean, for what's being done there,
With you,
is that then staying the same in the ring, and are they getting 80%? No, those are the ones that are probably then having, you know, mistakes too in the ring once they get in there. But I just think that's overworking a horse and not really keeping it in a happy and harmonious way. That word, to me, that's not harmonious.
And I would like to add something. Sometimes you have clinicians that come from very big barns, very important barns across the Atlantic, that have their horses working a lot on that. So they're used to do that, and the horses have the natural ability and are already supple enough to do that. But sometimes they come, and then in one day, they want to achieve, or 2 days, or 3 days, whatever it is, they want to achieve what their horses are used to do every day for so many years. So I think we have to be careful on that, because that's, as Gretchen was saying, that's when you can put too much strength, and it doesn't always work, because the most important thing, as Bill was saying, is to have, you know, an athletic horse, but that is happy, and that you're not just breaking too much so that it doesn't work, and you just make the rhythm and end up with a lame horse or something like that.
Well, the welfare of the horses has to be our first priority through everything. And I think with the questions that were asked, I mean, it has to be appropriate to that horse's age and his degree of fitness, as you said, and his physical and athletic ability. I mean, that all has to be taken into consideration. That's where I think good trainers are.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that what they're doing is bad, not at all. But you just have to take into consideration the natural ability of a horse, the stage of training where he is at, and, you know, make him more and more and more athletic. But you cannot, you know, from the first day say like, okay, we're gonna do this, doesn't matter what, we go all the way across the diagonal, because then at the end it cannot be that good. Couple of strides, good, and then starts increasing the stiffness of the angle, the stiffness of the diagonal, and make it more supple. I think that's important. I think that's very important. You always have to take into consideration what's the level of your horse, and not every single recipe works for everybody. Okay, any more questions?
No, muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Now we can go to happy hour, and you can ask.
There you go. Thank you for joining, everybody, and Cesar, thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Cesar, our friend, for
So nice meeting you. Thank you so
you.
much for your advice.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you and nice to see.
Everyone stay
Special
Yeah,
thanks to Skills for joining.
stay healthy.
And thank you everybody for joining.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ahí
Bye
me
bye.
avisas la próxima vez, César.
Ya llevo 12, claro que te mantengo informada. Todas las
Gracias.
semanas hacemos un...
Lo que pasa es que ahorita
claro.
empezamos la lluvia, hemos estado sin electricidad varias semanas, entonces no es tan fácil.